came a long way from St. Louis. You climbed the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis. You broke a lot of hearts between. And here we go with the Thank Clapton. It's Friday edition of the Radioactive Take. I'm Bryan Styble, longtime commercial news talk radio host. As we get the mic flag in the frame here. Pretending to be on the radio over WBQS, News Talk Radio. And I mean, don't you remember on the graffiti on the walls back in the 60s and 70s? Clapton is God. That's why it's the Thank Clapton. It's Friday edition of the Narrowcast. And here we go for the 25th of August, 2023. What a week. What a mugshot. And lots can be said about it. Lots are being said about the mugshot. Probably going to end up on the cover of Time magazine, I would imagine. Won't be Person of the Year. He already won that anyway. I think Trump did. But good luck to him. And come up with your own mugshot jokes if you like. And talking to the political thing, Vivek, as he pronounces it, as it is pronounced, he told Sean Hannity that it rhymes with cake, Vivek Ramaswamy. And he's coming under fire because he hasn't voted in at least primaries in Ohio there, Republican primaries. And that's not my problem with him. My problem with him is he's only 37 years old. And I know the Constitution only stipulates 35. But no, 37 years old, he should strap on a Stratocaster and play rock and roll music. Ramaswamy should. Not presidential timber, in the view of the radioactive guy. And by the way, Putin says he didn't do it. That plane coming down from the sky that killed the Wagner Group chief. Don't point it at him, the finger of blame. And make of that what you will. But while everybody's talking about those things, I thought I would devote this edition of the Narrowcast to talking about Ice Station Zebra. The Rock Hudson film. Alistair MacLean wrote the novel it's based on. And it's hardly his best work. I haven't read any of his work, but I saw Where Eagles Dare and loved it, and The Guns of Navarone, and that's a monumental picture. And he's also behind Ice Station Zebra, but the script just isn't there. It's a Cold War thing. Rock Hudson plays the captain of a nuclear submarine that's heading up to the North Pole to retrieve a Soviet satellite that fell down. And it's hardly my favorite Rock Hudson film. In fact, he wasn't a dramatic actor, not convincingly. I am a fan of Rock Hudson, and not just because he's a lefty. But the Doris Day movies, those are iconic. So much so that a lot of people mistakenly think they made 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or even 9 films like Tracy and Hepburn. Tracy and Hepburn did make 9 films together, but Doris Day and Rock Hudson only made 3. And all 3 had Tony Randall, too. But if you want comedic Rock Hudson, and I do, I love him in comedies. Took him a while to get the hang of it. No, it didn't. He started with his first comedy was Pillow Talk, so scratch that. He was comedic gold as soon as he tried it. He got some coaching from Doris Day. She knew how to do it. And anyway, comedic Rock Hudson, 2 films. Come September, set in and shot in Italy on the Riviera there. And with Gina Lollobrigida. And that's the film that Bobby Darin met Sandra Dee on. And they got married. Come September. Fantastic film. And what about Man's Favorite Sport? It's a much more obscure one. And it's Man's Favorite Sport with a question mark. He's playing opposite Paula Prentice, who I've been a fan of ever since 1968 when I first saw her with her husband. And they've been married since 1960, one of the true Hollywood successful marriages. Paula Prentice and Richard Benjamin, and He and She on CBS. A famous quote came out of that. They canceled it after one season, lousy ratings, but CBS knew what they had, and they said some executive went down in Hollywood history for saying, this is the best show we've ever canceled. But Paula Prentice and Richard Benjamin have done a lot of things in the ensuing years. But anyway, I digress, as we tend to here on the Radioactive Take. Ice Station Zebra is this movie that is identified for very good reason with Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes had a thing about it, and I don't know what. Well, look, you might say you got a thing about it, Styble. You say you watched it on TCM now 4 or 5 times, whatever the number is. And yeah, the number's up there. And it's a long film. It's got an intermission. And again, it's hardly one of these great blockbuster films, but I'm interested in it because Howard Hughes was so interested in it. I've seen it maybe a half a dozen times, but he saw it at least 150 times, including one long stretch where he had it in a loop. And he was just watching it over and over. And this went on for 10, 11 days, something like this. This is in the early 70s. It's all described in a book called Citizen Hughes. And that's a takeoff, the title is, on the guy that is identified with Xanadu. Only that's Citizen Kane, and that Xanadu has an X. This Xanadu, from which we broadcast, narrowcast here in Florida, is Xanadu with a Z. But anyway, but that one, the Xanadu and Citizen Kane is in Florida, unlike the real deal, which is San Simeon, William Randolph Hearst's place that the movie was based on. Thinly disguised. That's out in California, about halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco on the coast there. But Xanadu in the movie is on the west coast of Florida, down there in or near Sarasota. It's fictively situated. But there's nothing fictive about this Xanadu. We exist, even if WBQS News Talk Radio doesn't. But anyway, so it's all in this book, and there's a lot of books, a lot of biographies of Howard Hughes. Take your pick, but this one's Citizen Hughes, and he describes how he was so obsessed with this film, he had it on the loop and just watched it over and over and over and over for days and days in a darkened screening room, and his only diet supposedly was Hershey's chocolate bars. I mean, everybody knows that Hughes was eccentric, but that's over the top, if you ask me. But I guess you can get away with that if you're a billionaire. And Hughes was a billionaire when it meant something to be a billionaire. Nowadays, you can become a billionaire just by playing your cards right with an internet IPO or something. 30 minutes later, you have $1,000 million and you're a certified billionaire. But Howard Hughes got to be a billionaire several times over in a lot of different ways. Not just aviation, but also, of course, RKO. He owned RKO, lock, stock, and barrel for a few years. And he had this thing for Ice Station Zebra. And by the way, the reason it was being played by TCM, Turner Classic Movies, is it's part of their Summer Under the Stars thing they do every August, where they feature one actor for a whole day's worth of films. And that's Borgnine. It was the star of the day at TCM today, and he's not just in Ice Station Zebra. He's got a prominent role, plays a guy with a thick Russian accent, did a fine job. He was a great actor, no question about it. Won the Oscar for Marty, for heaven's sake, but he was also in The Dirty Dozen and The Wild Bunch. They played that right after Ice Station Zebra. But this got me thinking about Howard Hughes, and I don't know if I got time to tell the whole Clifford Irving story, but what brought Howard Hughes as much out of hiding as he ever did once he became a recluse, boarded up there, or at least sealed in, never opened for 6 months or for 6 years. Never opened his curtains. Supposedly, they were rotting away. He was like Elvis. Elvis used to have his Memphis Mafia guys put up aluminum foil in the windows in hotel suites he was in. Didn't want to see the sun for some reason. And Howard Hughes was the same way. He never looked outside. He was on top of the Desert Inn, I guess. Eventually bought the hotel, but he had a whole floor. Maybe even he had 2 floors. He had a top floor penthouse that he lived in, and then the floor beneath that where all of his business meetings took place. So the guys that were working for him, a handful of people, principally Mormons. For some reason, he liked to hire Mormons, Howard Hughes did. But they would see him and nobody else would, until Clifford Irving started claiming, he convinced the publisher that he had an exclusive deal, a secret deal with Howard Hughes to write his autobiography, just like as if, and it was no as if, Alex Haley really did write the autobiography through agreement with Malcolm X. But this was an autobiography that was totally fictional because Clifford Irving had no connection with Hughes. But he knew because he was such a recluse, he thought he could pull this off. And he did to a large degree. He got on 60 Minutes, whole segment. I believe it was Morley Safer. I might be wrong about that. But the whole house of cards came crashing down soon enough. Irving and his wife as well. She was involved in this, and they both served time in prison after this. And what it did was it got Howard Hughes not to come out in public. Still no photographs. I don't think there's any photographs of Howard Hughes past the 1950s, and this is in the early 70s, that he said, look, I got to do something about this. So what does he do? He contacts some people who are connected in the media, and he arranges to have 7 experienced and trusted by him journalists, I guess people he'd known in Hollywood and over the years and what have you, but he's got 7 of them on a speakerphone with a telephonic press conference. And this took place, I looked it up, took place on Sunday, January 9th, 1972. I remember this. There was a lot of talk about this because everybody was saying, wow, could this guy possibly be lying, Clifford Irving? He was on 60 Minutes. They wouldn't air a fraudulent story, would they? Well, they ended up doing so. But this got Hughes to stage this telephonic press conference. He's saying, look, I don't know this guy. I've never met him. He's just making it all up, and somebody should get him to stop. And that was the last time we heard the voice of Howard Hughes. I listened to the tape a bunch of times. I'm sure it's on the internet. Look it up on a competing YouTube channel, for heaven's sake. So that's the Howard Hughes thing. And, about Ernest Borgnine, the featured star that was the whole reason they were airing Ice Station Zebra. I never met Ernest Borgnine, although I was a huge fan of his, and I think most of America was. McHale's Navy, Quentin, Commander Quentin. That's not what my Q stands for. Those are my initials, BQS, and this is WBQS, News Talk Radio. But that's not what the Q stands for, but it was the name of the character he played for so many years on McHale's Navy, Quentin McHale. And I had occasion to end up standing about not more than 5 or 6 feet from Ernest Borgnine, but he was up. I'll explain how right now by telling you that this was part of the run-up to the so-called Hollywood Christmas Parade. Hollywood, California, not that one down in Florida. It's just north of Miami. Different Hollywood. This is the Hollywood. And every year on the day after Thanksgiving, they have the Hollywood Christmas Parade. And I, without press credentials, I wasn't on the radio in those days. This is 1981, I guess. The day after, or the night after Thanksgiving, Friday night. After all the football's done, they start the Hollywood Christmas Parade. And he was on one of the floats. I don't think he was the Grand Marshal, although he might have been. I don't know. But he was up there, and he was only, if he would have reached his arm down, he could have touched my hand. But he never even noticed I was there. He was talking to a woman on the float, waiting for the float to go out. And he wasn't going to be the last float, but he was towards the end there. So This lasted for about 10 minutes. And, of course, Santa Claus is the last float to come out of the Hollywood Christmas parade. But I watched him talking to this woman, and I don't know if it was Tova, who later would become almost as well known as Ernest Borgnine was, who lived into his 90s. She lived a long life, too, and she was hawking those various cosmetic wares that she sold on QVC and some other home shopping networks, I do believe. And I'm not even sure that was her, because I didn't know who she was. This is, again, years before I would see her on television, so it might have been a different woman that he was on the back of this float with. But that's my Ernest Borgnine story. That's how close I got to him. No less than about 6 feet, and it was up. I'm talking to this guy on the phone this afternoon. Not sure what I was going to do for the Thanks Zeus It's Friday edition of the Narrowcast. And I'm calling him up because I had heard, as part of our talk radio broadcast, he was guest hosting. I had heard Mark Davis, guy works out of the so-called Metroplex, Dallas-Fort Worth, but he was substituting for Dennis Prager's L.A.-based show. And as theme music, he was using a recording by, and it's pretty peppy as far as Leonard Cohen's work did. A lot of Leonard Cohen's work was not that peppy, but this has got a nice beat, and it's got some great lyrics. It's called Everybody Knows, and it's a tune that a guy I used to work with in talk radio many years ago, about 30 years ago. It was his theme song, so I was calling him up to say, hey, Andrew, this guy Mark Davis is ripping you off. He was using your theme song as his theme song on Dennis Prager's program there. That's why I was calling Andrew Barbano, but on the air he's known as Andrew Barbano, better known as Barbano on the Barbed Wire. Yeah, in fact, I'm not even sure. I knew his name was Andrew. I thought he was one of these one-name guys, like Gallagher. Not Mike Gallagher, the radio talk show host. I'm talking about the watermelon smashing guy who just died. I thought he just had one name the first day I had met him and what have you. Actually, I met him in Reno about 6 months before we worked together on something called 770 The Source, a San Francisco Bay Area station that had our studios, as it happened, in Sacramento, state capital. But he was doing morning drive. Barbano on the Barbed Wire was, and I was doing afternoon drive at 770 The Source. Quite a signal through much of Northern California. But our principal audience was in the Bay Area there. And Andrew was fantastic, and I knew him to be very factually scrupulous. Not many mistakes on his program. And I wanted to alert him of the fact that Mark Davis was poaching his theme music. He said, well, lots of people have it. Leonard Cohen's a famous guy. And so he wasn't put off by that. And Andrew hasn't been on the air, I don't think, for quite a few years. And he's out there in Reno now. And we're talking about various things, and Dylan's Nobel Prize in Literature comes up. And we talk about that a little bit. And I didn't know he was a Dylan fan. I never talked to him about Dylan. I got this thing where when I was on talk radio is an AM thing. My entire career was on the AM band, and that's proudly on the AM band. Whereas Dylan's an FM act, so I never did Dylan on radio in those days. So I was surprised he even knew I was identified with Dylan, but he was. And he turns out to be a fan of Dylan's too. So good for him and good for Andrew Barbano. But because we're talking about the Nobel Prize, he says, by the way, do you know why there's no Nobel Prize in mathematics? I said, no, I don't know that. Is there a good reason? And Barbano on the Barbed Wire reports to me that that's not only a good reason, it's a hilarious story. And the way the story goes, Alfred Nobel, the dynamite guy, sets up all his fortune, his endowment, then is used to fund the prizes that lots of people win in various disciplines, mostly out of Sweden. The only prize that doesn't come out of Sweden is the big one, the Nobel Peace Prize. That comes out of Norway, Oslo. But Sweden's got all the other prizes, and each prize has a different committee that selects it. And I was telling him how I had predicted that Dylan was going to win the Nobel Prize 15 years ago. This is in 2019. 2009. I predicted in a thing I called a prematurely published Dylan obituary. I predicted he would win the Nobel Prize, but I thought it would be the first music award. And yeah, I said, there is no music award, but there ought to be. Set up another committee in Stockholm, and he's going to win the first one. That's what I predicted in 2009 in a piece called Like a Rolling Tombstone. It's available on the internet like everything else is, but it's way, way too long. You know that phrase, too long didn't read, TLDR. That applies to this one. This is 40,000 words. And it's rather fanciful, but it's all about Dylan. And I did make that prediction, and Dylan wins the Nobel Prize in Literature, as it turns out. And that's what Andrew and I were talking about. But he says, what about the Mathematics Prize? Why isn't there one? Well, here's the reason. Alfred Nobel, as the story goes, had his wife leave him, and she ran off with a mathematician. And he just, I don't know if he hated mathematicians thereafter, but he put it in his will. There will be no prize in mathematics. And there isn't. They got their own prize. I think it's called the Field or Fields Medal, something like that. And so they're being taken care of. But there is no Nobel Prize in mathematics, and it's due to this unfortunate circumstance where Alfred Nobel's wife runs off with a mathematician. I'm glad I looked into it. I told you that Andrew Barbano on the barbed wire is factually solid, but this turns out to be a myth. I kid you not. It so happens that Alfred Nobel wasn't even married. He did have a mistress, but he wasn't married, so his wife couldn't have run off. There was no wife, and that story's just not true. I'm not sure. There might be other reasons that there's no Nobel Prize in mathematics, but not that. But anyway, if had he lived in the 20th century and there was a Nobel Prize in mathematics, this is the guy that would have won it, hands down. That's Euler. He's part of the Xanadu Hall of Fame. He was an 18th century Swiss mathematician, and I could talk for a long time about him. Most important figure in the history of mathematics for my money. And I spent a lot of time reading books about exotic branches of mathematics. I can't crunch the numbers or the equations, but I can read about it as a layman, and I do. And this guy's number one, no question about it. And you may know him as Euler, because many people mispronounce his name. It's spelled E-U-L-E-R, but it's Euler. And again, I could talk for the next fortnight on Euler and not exhaust everything he did. He contributed to every realm of mathematics. But I'm just gonna instead focus on this E. You know E? It's almost as famous a constant in mathematics and in nature as a much better known constant. That would be pi. And by the way, Euler's the guy that popularized the use of pi for in terms of notation, it's called in mathematics. Pi is got that Greek letter pi, lowercase pi. The reason that number has that letter assigned, it was popularized by Euler. And he also threw in a plug for himself because E, which is almost as important as pi, E is named after himself or initialed after himself. And you may know this constant. A lot of people know 3.14 in case of pi, and it's just an approximation. It's an irrational number. I bet you knew that, but did you know it's also transcendental? Won't try to explain what that means, but not many transcendental numbers that we know about. There's lots of them out there. There's an infinite number of them, but the ones we know about are few and far between. But pi's one, and so is E. And just like people know 3.14, 159, 26535, I think is the way pi goes. Well, E goes 2.71828. And there's not just a lot more digits. There's an infinite number of digits, and they never repeat, as is the case with every irrational number. Don't have to be a transcendental number for that to be the case, but E is transcendental. And here's a way to remember this constant. And if you're a banker, you probably know all about this constant because interest is compounded in relation to this number. 2.71828. How would you remember that? Well, I'll tell you how. If you know about Andrew Jackson, our 7th president, and the guy on our $20 bill, they're trying to take him off there because he was a slaveholder. But I've been to where he's buried. He's buried in Nashville at the Hermitage, about a half hour, 45 minutes northeast of Nashville. That's where Andrew Jackson and his wife Rachel are buried. And if you know a decent amount about Andrew Jackson, and you should, he was a very important president, especially to the Democrat Party. Well, this is how you remember what he is. Andrew Jackson was a 2-term president. It's one of the reasons he's on the $20 bill. 2-term president. He was the 7th president after John Quincy Adams, who was the 6th, and before Martin Van Buren, who was the 8th, who was his vice president in the 2nd term. But Jackson was the 7th president, 2-term president, 7th president, and he won the election of 1828. He also won the election of 1832. But that's a mnemonic, an Andrew Jackson, the Andrew Jackson mnemonic for E. I was blown away by that when I read that. So that's some mathematics for you here. And I guess this, thank Zeus, it's Friday edition of the Radioactive Take has gone on long enough. But I did want to close with a remarkable thing that Dennis Prager said on, I told you he was playing hooky earlier in the week on his nationally syndicated program, but he came in on Friday to do the show, and he wrapped up, but this is the last thing he said all week, and it struck me almost as much as the Trump mugshot visually struck everybody, and that is, he said, Dennis Prager said, that one of the reasons the Jewish faith is so important, and I'm a converted Jew, non-believing, militant agnostic, but I am a converted Jew. So I got nothing against the Jews. I joined them, wanted to join a winning team. And Prager is saying that the reason Jewish theology was such an advance over the mythology, if you will, of the Romans and the Greeks, Zeus, Jupiter, that crowd, the reason it was such an advance is because there was no sex for God. The Roman gods and the Greek gods not only had a lot of flaws, they had a lot of sex too. But Yahweh, Moses' God, no sex. That's what Dennis Prager said. And that's something to think about for the next couple of days while we step away from the WBQS microphone. We hope you will be there Monday when, once again, we reconvene this little narrowcast we call the Radioactive Take for 5 more editions of the program. And in the meantime, bid you a left-handed salute from Florida.